They say you never hear the bullet that kills you, but nobody ever said anything about the tree that buries you. I can still hear the house groaning. It's a sound like a ship sinking in deep water, the structural beams screaming as they bend, the drywall popping like knuckles. But I'm not underwater. I'm in my living room, or what's left of it. It's been 6 hours since the sun went out. Not an eclipse, not nightfall. It's 3 p.m., but if I look at the sliver of space between the boarded-up window and the frame, all I see is green. Dark, oily, impenetrable green. A wall of leaves and vines so thick they've choked out the daylight completely. They say you never hear the bullet that kills you, but nobody ever said anything about the tree that buries you. I can still hear the house groaning. It's a sound like a ship sinking in deep water, the structural beams screaming as they bend, the drywall popping like knuckles. But I'm not underwater. I'm in my living room, or what's left of it. It's been 6 hours since the sun went out. Not an eclipse, not nightfall. It's 3 p.m., but if I look at the sliver of space between the boarded-up window and the frame, all I see is green. Dark, oily, impenetrable green. A wall of leaves and vines so thick they've choked out the daylight completely. I'm sitting in the hallway, the only room without windows, clutching a flashlight that's starting to flicker. The air smells thick. It smells like a lawnmower ran over a nest of copperhead snakes, cut grass and metallic blood. If you're hearing this, if this signal is actually punching through the canopy, don't go outside. Don't touch the grass. Don't look at the flowers. Just lock your doors, find the center of your house, and pray your foundation is stronger than the roots. Because the world didn't end with a bang. It ended with a bloom. My name is Elias. I lived at 402 Oak Ridge Drive. It was a Tuesday. It's always a Tuesday, isn't it? The day of the week that feels the safest, the most boring. The day nothing is supposed to happen. I want to tell you exactly how it started. No skipping details. Because if you're still out there, the details are the only things that might keep you alive. 1:15 p.m. I remember the time because I had just reheated a cup of coffee. I work from home, designing kitchen renovations for people with too much money and not enough taste. I was staring at a CAD rendering of a kitchen island, trying to decide between granite and quartz. That was the biggest problem in my life. Granite or quartz. I was sitting at my desk, which faces the front window. My view was the cul-de-sac. Standard suburbia. Manicured lawns, fire hydrants, Mrs. Gable across the street tending to her prize-winning hydrangeas. It started with the birds. You don't realize how loud nature is until it shuts up. 1 second there were sparrows fighting in the gutters and a cardinal singing in the maple tree. The next second, silence. Absolute vacuum-sealed silence. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was like someone cut the audio cable to the world. I looked up from my screen. The silence was heavy. It pressed against the glass. Even Mrs. Gable stopped. She was holding her garden hose, just standing there, looking up at the sky. I stood up and walked to the window. The sky was clear, blue, a few wispy clouds, but the light was wrong. It's hard to describe.
You know that yellow-orange tint the world gets right before a tornado? This was like that, but verdant. The sunlight hitting the asphalt seemed to have a greenish hue, like we were suddenly underwater or looking through a stained glass bottle. Then came the vibration. It wasn't an earthquake. I've lived through earthquakes. They roll. This was a frequency, a hum. I felt it in my teeth first, a low-grade buzzing that made the water in my coffee mug ripple in perfect concentric circles. My phone lit up. No ringtone, just the screen waking up. Then the TV in the living room turned itself on. Beep, beep, beep. The emergency alert system. That sound always makes your stomach drop, but this time it felt coordinated with the vibration on the floor. I walked into the living room. The blue screen was scrolling text, but the voiceover was garbled, choppy. Immediate biological anomaly. Avoid contact with soil. Shelter in. Extreme growth detected. Extreme growth? What the hell did that mean? I looked back out the window. Mrs. Gable was dropping her hose. She was backing away from her flower bed. I squinted. The hydrangeas, those big, puffy blue flowers she loved, they were twitching, not shaking in the wind because there was no wind. They were twitching like muscles. I saw a vine, a simple English ivy that crawled up her trellis, detach itself. It didn't fall. It reached. It uncurled like a whip, stiffened, and then lashed out, wrapping around the porch railing with a speed that blurred in my vision. My brain tried to reject it. Wind, I told myself, just a freak gust of wind. But then the pavement at the end of the driveway cracked. It was the sound like a gunshot. Crack! A fissure zigzagged across the gray asphalt, and out of that crack something surged. It looked like a root, but it was thick as a man's thigh, pale and knotted. It pulsed, heaving upward, shattering the concrete like it was styrofoam. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay, Elias, think." But you can't think when the laws of physics are breaking down in your front yard.
1:22 p.m. 7 minutes. That's all it took for the neighborhood to die. I watched, paralyzed, as the old maple tree in my front yard, the one I'd hung a tire swing on for my nephews, exploded. That's the only word for it. The bark split open with a wet, tearing sound, revealing new, raw wood underneath that was expanding in real time. The branches shot outward, lengthening by feet every second. It looked like a time-lapse video you'd see in a nature documentary, sped up 1,000 times. But this was real life, and it was violent. One of the branches slammed into the hood of my Toyota in the driveway. Metal screamed and buckled. The windshield shattered into a million diamonds. The branch didn't stop. It just kept growing, pushing the engine block into the asphalt, crushing the car like a soda can. I ran to the front door. Why? To lock it? To go outside? I don't know. Panic makes you stupid. I grabbed the handle, and that's when I heard the screaming. Mrs. Gable. I looked through the sidelight window next to the door. She was tangled. She was in her yard, fighting. The hydrangeas weren't flowers anymore. They were grappling hooks. The vines had wrapped around her ankles and were pulling her down. "Help!" she shrieked. It was a thin, ragged sound. "It's got me! It's got me!" I unlocked the door. I had to. She was right there, 20 feet away. I threw the door open, and the heat hit me like a physical blow. It was humid, tropical, smelling of ozone and crushed fertilizer. "Mrs. Gable!" I yelled.
I took one step onto my porch, and the world hissed at me. My lawn, the grass, it was rising up like hackles on a dog. The blades were lengthening, turning serrated and rigid. They were already calf-high and climbing. Mrs. Gable was on her back now. The ivy had wrapped around her torso. I watched as a thick, woody root burst out of the soil right beneath her. It didn't just wrap around her, it enveloped her. It moved over her body like a slow wave of snakes, tightening. She looked at me, her eyes wide, bursting with capillaries. She reached a hand out. "Elias!" And then a vine from the trellis shot down, straight into her open mouth. Her scream cut off instantly. It was replaced by a wet, muffled, choking sound. Then the greenery swarmed. In seconds, literal seconds, she was gone. Just a mound of writhing green shapes where a woman used to be. I froze. My brain simply crashed. I was staring at the mound, unable to process the horror. Something brushed my shoe. I looked down. The runner vines from my own porch plants, a hanging basket of ferns, were lowering themselves toward my neck. On the ground, the grass was creeping over the edge of the concrete porch, feeling for my boots. I scrambled backward, falling into the entryway, kicking at the door. I slammed it shut and threw the deadbolt. My breath was coming in short, hyperventilating gasps. Thump. Something hit the door from the outside, hard. Thump, scrape, scrape. It sounded like heavy ropes being dragged across the wood. The peephole went dark. A leaf or a stem had pressed against the glass. I scrambled to my feet and back down the hallway. "Wake up," I said aloud. "Wake up! Wake up! Wake up!" But the nightmare was just getting started.
1:45 p.m. The light in the house was dying. I ran from room to room, doing the only thing I could think of, checking the perimeter. The kitchen window faces the backyard, which borders a small nature preserve. I used to love that view. Privacy, trees. Now it was a tsunami. The forest wasn't just growing, it was advancing. The tree line, which used to be 50 yards away, was now at my fence. The wooden fence posts were snapping like toothpicks. I watched a massive oak tree's roots surge under the ground, lifting my patio furniture into the air and tossing it through the sliding glass door of the dining room. Crash! Glass sprayed across the hardwood floor. The sound was deafening. "No! No! No!" I screamed. I grabbed the dining room table, a heavy mahogany thing I'd inherited from my parents, and flipped it on its side, shoving it against the broken, shattered opening. It was pathetic, a wooden shield against a living army. Through the broken gap, the vines poured in. They didn't move like plants should. They moved like tentacles, questing, searching. They slithered over the broken glass, feeling the floorboards. I saw thorns. Not little rose thorns. These were 3 inches long, black and dripping with a clear, viscous fluid. One of the vines lashed out and struck the table leg. The wood hissed where the fluid touched it. Acid? Digestive enzymes? I didn't want to know. I backed out of the dining room and slammed the double doors shut. I could hear them on the other side. Slither. Tap, tap, tap. Testing the wood. I needed weapons. I needed supplies. I ran to the kitchen. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the knife block. I grabbed the biggest chef knife I had. It felt ridiculously light. What was I gonna do? Chop down a forest? I opened the pantry. Canned food. Water. I had a case of bottled water I bought for hurricane season. I dragged it into the hallway. Why the hallway? Because it has no windows. It's the spine of the house.
If the walls collapse, the center creates a void. That's what they tell you in earthquake drills. 2:15 p.m. The darkness was almost total. The vegetation had grown over the roof. I could hear it on the shingles, a constant heavy shifting sound, like 1,000 people walking on the roof at once. The skylights in the living room were blacked out. The ambient light in the house shifted from the warm afternoon sun to that sickly, deep underwater gloom. Then the power died. It didn't flicker, it just cut. The refrigerator hum stopped. The microwave clock went blank. The silence inside the house returned, but now it was layered over the sounds from outside. The cracking of wood, the rustling of leaves, the crushing of the world. I sat on the floor of the hallway, the chef knife in one hand, my phone in the other. 10% battery, no signal. Emergency calls only flashed at the top, but when I tried to dial 911, it just beeped 3 times and disconnected. The cell towers were probably wrapped in vines, crushed or pulled down. I was alone. I listened. I tried to map the house by sound. Crack. That was the garage door buckling. Hiss. That was the dining room, the vines eating at the barricade. Drip. Drip. Water? No. Sap. Thick, heavy sap leaking through the ceiling vents. I aimed my flashlight at the air vent above me. A tendril, thin as a wire, was curling through the slats. It was pale white, devoid of chlorophyll, looking for a way in. I scrambled up, grabbed a stack of books from the hallway console table, and shoved them against the vent, holding them there. I needed tape, duct tape. I ran to the utility closet, grabbed the silver roll, and taped the books over the vent. Then I taped the gaps under the doors. I taped the keyholes. I was sealing myself in a tomb, but I didn't care. I just wanted the green out. I slumped back down against the wall, sliding until I hit the floor. My watch beeped. 2:30 p.m. 1 hour. It had only been 1 hour since I was drinking coffee, since Mrs. Gable was watering her flowers. Now, Mrs. Gable was fertilizer, and I was canned food, waiting to be opened.
That's when I heard the scratching. Not on the walls, not on the roof, under the floorboards. There is a specific kind of fear that comes from the ground up. We're evolved to look forward, to scan the horizon, maybe to check the sky for storms. But we trust the ground. The ground is the constant. When I heard that scratching under the floorboards, that trust evaporated. I pressed my ear against the laminate wood flooring of the hallway. It was cold against my cheek, but beneath it, I could feel heat radiating up. The scratching stopped, then started again. Scrape, scrape, crack. It sounded wet, like someone dragging a heavy, soaked rope against the underside of the subfloor. Rats, I whispered, lying to myself again. Just rats running from the noise. But rats don't exert pressure. I could feel the floorboards bulging upward just a fraction of an inch right against my ear. The wood groaned, a high-pitched whine of timber being pushed past its breaking point. I scrambled back, shining my flashlight at the spot. The laminate plank, a fake gray oak finish, started to crown. The seam between 2 boards split open. Dust puffed up into the beam of light. Then a tip appeared. It wasn't a claw, it was a root hair, but not like any root I'd ever seen. It was pale, almost translucent white, about the thickness of a pencil. It wiggled blindly into the hallway air, sensing the open space. It looked like a deep-sea worm.
I watched, mesmerized and horrified as it twisted. It tapped the baseboard. Tap, tap. Then the wood beneath it splintered. Crack! A thicker section followed the pilot route. This one was dark, knobby, covered in coarse fibers. It punched through the floor like a slow-motion fist. I grabbed the chef's knife. My hand was sweating so much the handle felt slick. I crawled forward on my knees and stabbed at the white thing. The knife went in easily. It was soft, fleshy vegetation, but the reaction was instant. The root thrashed. It whipped back and forth like a severed snake, spraying a milky white sap across the floorboards. The sap sizzled faintly where it hit the varnish. I scrambled back, gasping. The root recoiled, pulling itself back down into the hole, leaving a jagged gap in my floor about the size of a quarter. I stared at that hole. Through it, I could hear the crawl space. It sounded like a nest of vipers, a churning, sliding, writhing mass of growth beneath my house. They were in the foundation. They were lifting the house off the ground, or maybe they were pulling it down into the earth. I couldn't stay in the hallway, not without reinforcing it, not without better tools than a kitchen knife. I needed to go to the garage.
The garage. In a normal world, it's 20 steps away. Through the living room, past the laundry alcove, out the fire door. Maybe 10 seconds of walking. But this wasn't my house anymore. It was a cave system I was exploring for the first time. I stood up, gripping the flashlight. My legs felt like lead. I unlocked the door leading from the hallway to the living room and cracked it open. The heat hit me instantly. It was a wet, suffocating heat like walking into a greenhouse in the middle of July with the vents closed. The air was thick with moisture. I shone the light into the living room. My God, I breathed. It had only been, 2 hours? Maybe 3? But the room was already transforming. The dining room barricade, the table I had shoved against the broken glass, was gone, not moved, consumed. A thick knot of vines, dark green and pulsing with purple veins, had wrapped around it completely. The vines had pushed further into the room, creeping across the ceiling like veins under skin. Tiny white flowers were blooming along the vines. As I swept the light over them, they seemed to turn toward the beam. I stepped onto the carpet. Squelch. The carpet was damp. Moss was already forming in the corners of the room, climbing the drywall. The speed of it was impossible. It defied biology. It was hyper-evolution on steroids. I kept the light low, trying not to disturb whatever lived in here now. I hugged the wall, moving toward the laundry room. Drip. I looked up. The ceiling fan was sagging, weighed down by something heavy in the attic above. A dark liquid was dripping from the light fixture, pooling on the coffee table. I made it to the laundry room. The air here smelled sharper, chemical, detergent mixed with that overwhelming copper blood smell of the sap. I reached the door to the garage. It was a heavy, fire-rated steel door. I put my hand on the knob. It was hot, not warm, hot, like a car hood in the sun. I hesitated. If I opened this, would I be letting something in, or was I just letting myself out into something worse? I thought about the root coming through the floor in the hallway. I thought about the fragility of the chef's knife. I turned the knob and shoved. The door stuck. The frame had shifted. I had to throw my shoulder into it. 1, 2, crunch. The door flew open and I stumbled into the garage. It was pitch black, but the air was different here. Dry, dusty, smelling of gasoline and old cardboard.
I swept the flashlight around. The garage door, the big double door leading to the driveway, was bowed inward. The metal panels were screaming under the pressure of the branches outside. I could see daylight, faint, green, filtered daylight through the gaps where the metal had buckled. But it was holding, for now. My car, the Toyota. I tried not to look at it, but the beam caught the reflection of the crushed glass. The roof of the car was flattened all the way to the seats. If I had been in there... Focus. Tools. I moved to the workbench. My hands were shaking, but I forced them to work. Hammer. An old Estwing framing hammer, solid steel. Good. Nails. A box of 16 penny nails. Hatchet. It was dull, used for camping trips years ago, but it had an edge. I slid it through my belt loop. Duct tape. I grabbed 3 rolls. Crowbar. Heavy. Reassuring. Then I saw it, hanging on the pegboard, covered in sawdust. My respirator. I'm an architect. I do site visits. Sometimes we deal with asbestos or mold during renovations. I had a half-face 3M respirator with P100 filters. I grabbed it. I didn't know why exactly. Call it instinct. Call it a premonition. But looking at the mold growing in the living room, I knew the air in this house was going to become a problem. I loaded everything into a canvas tote bag. It clanked loudly. Clang! The sound echoed in the garage. Suddenly, the buckling metal of the garage door groaned. A shadow moved across the gap of light at the bottom. I froze, flashlight off. I stood there in the absolute dark, clutching the hammer. Sniff, sniff. Something was outside the door, sniffing the gap. The sniffing sounded wet, guttural. It wasn't a plant. Plants don't sniff. Was it a dog, a coyote, or something else? The metal scratched. A long, slow drag of claws against aluminum. Grah. A low vocalization. It sounded like a throat clearing, but deeper, vibrating. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would give away my position. I backed away slowly, step by step, until my heel hit the threshold of the laundry room. I stepped back inside, pulled the heavy steel door shut, and locked the deadbolt. I leaned my forehead against the cool metal, shaking uncontrollably. There were things out there. Not just vines, not just roots, things. I turned back to the laundry room, shone my light toward the living room, and saw the glitter. The air in the living room was filled with golden dust. It was drifting from those white flowers on the vines. They had opened fully. They were puffing out clouds of yellow gold particulate. I watched a mote of dust land on the damp carpet. Instantly, a fuzz of white mold sprang up around it. My throat seized. I had breathed it in. I dropped the bag, ripped the respirator out, and jammed it onto my face. I pulled the straps tight, so tight they dug into my scalp. I coughed, a dry, hacking cough that tasted like metal into the mask. The filters caught the next breath. Clean air, or cleaner at least. I grabbed the bag and ran. I ran through the living room, kicking aside the moss, ignoring the heat, ignoring the pulsing vines on the ceiling. I made it back to the hallway and slammed the door. I taped the gaps. I taped the keyhole. I taped the bottom threshold until half a roll was gone. Then I sat down on the floor, the respirator still on my face, the hammer in my hand, staring at the hole in the floorboards. The root hadn't come back. Yet. But now I knew. The air was poison, the ground was alive, and outside, something with claws was testing the perimeter. I checked my watch. 4:15 p.m. The sun hadn't even set yet.
You don't realize how loud your own breathing is until you're wearing a respirator in a silent house. Click. Click. The rubber seal was digging into the bridge of my nose. Sweat was pooling in the chin cup. It was hot, claustrophobic, and uncomfortable.
but every time I thought about taking it off, I remembered that golden dust drifting in the living room. I remembered the white mold springing up instantly on the carpet. So I kept it on. I became a diver in my own home, surviving on filtered air. I spent the next hour turning the hallway into a bunker. It was the only room with no windows, no exterior walls, just 4 doors: living room, bathroom, spare bedroom, master bedroom. I used the duct tape to seal the cracks around every door frame. I taped the keyholes. I taped the electrical outlets. Who knew if the pollen could drift through the wall spaces? I was methodical. Tape, smooth, check. Tape, smooth, check. It gave my hands something to do so my brain wouldn't scream. I moved the supplies into a neat pile: the water bottles, the canned food, the hammer, the hatchet, the crowbar. My stomach growled, a deep, cramping pain. I hadn't eaten since breakfast? That felt like a week ago. I looked at a can of peaches. Pop-top lid, easy. But to eat, I'd have to break the seal of the mask. I sat there for 10 minutes just weighing the risk. Starvation takes weeks. Dehydration takes days. Suffocation takes minutes. But fungal infection? How fast was that? Fast, I muttered into the mask. It sounded muffled, like I was speaking from inside a bucket. I decided on a protocol. I went to the bathroom door, the guest bath attached to the hallway. I pressed my ear against the door. Silence. I unlocked it, slipped inside, and taped the door shut behind me quickly. The bathroom had an exhaust fan. I hit the switch. Nothing. Right, power's out. I shone the flashlight around. The tile was clean. No moss, no vines. I took a deep breath, held it, and pulled the mask off. The air smelled stale, but not sweet. No flower smell. I cracked a water bottle and chugged half of it in one go. Warm, plastic-tasting water. It was the best thing I'd ever had. I opened the peaches, drank the syrup, shoveled the fruit into my mouth with my fingers. Sticky, messy. I didn't care. Mask back on, pull the straps tight, test the seal. I sat on the toilet lid, trembling. This was my life now, eating peaches in the dark, terrified of the air. 7:45 p.m., sunset. I couldn't see the sun go down, obviously, but I felt it. The quality of the darkness changed. During the day, even with the windows covered by the green wall, there was a faint bioluminescent gloom, a sort of dirty twilight. But when the sun actually dipped below the horizon, the house went pitch black, absolute sensory deprivation tank black. And the sounds changed. During the day, the plants were aggressive, yes, but they were expanding, growing. The sounds were stretching sounds. Creak, pop, snap. At night, the sounds became predatory. I was sitting in the hallway, leaning against the linen closet door, when the hunting began. Thump. Something landed on the roof, something heavy. Skitter, skitter, skitter. It moved across the shingles with too many legs, then another thump and another. They were converging, the things I'd heard outside the garage. They were on the house now. I turned off my flashlight to save batteries. I sat in the dark, listening to the creatures traverse the roof of my home. They were testing the vents. I heard them scratching at the chimney cap. Then a new sound, a low, vibrating hum coming from the walls themselves. It wasn't a mechanical hum. It was organic, like a million cicadas buzzing at a frequency just on the edge of hearing. It was the vines. They were tightening. The house gave a massive, shuddering groan. The drywall opposite me cracked. I heard it tear like paper. Stop it. Just hold together, please. The pressure was increasing. The forest wasn't just growing over the house. It was squeezing it, crushing it like an empty beer can. I realized then that the hallway, my bunker, wasn't going to last. Eventually, the roof trusses would snap, the walls would bow in, I would be flattened between two sheets of drywall. I needed a way out, but going outside was suicide. The roof. If the house collapsed, the roof was the only place that wouldn't be buried. Plus, if rescue came, helicopters, drones, anything, they'd be looking down. But the attic access was in the garage, and the garage was compromised. Wait, no, there was a scuttle hole in the master bedroom closet, a tiny 18-inch square of plywood I'd pushed up once to run a cable wire. The master bedroom. I looked at the taped-up door at the end of the hallway. I hadn't checked that room yet. I just sealed it off. I needed to check it. If I had to escape up, that was my only route.
8:30 p.m. I stood in front of the master bedroom door. My hand hovered over the knob. Why was I so afraid of this room? It was my bedroom, my bed, my clothes. Because the master bedroom had French doors, glass doors that opened onto the back deck, and I knew, logically, that those glass doors were the weakest point in the house. I gripped the hatchet in my right hand, the flashlight in my left. I peeled back the tape. The sound of the adhesive ripping was deafening in the silence. Reep! I turned the knob. Locked. I unlocked it. I took a breath through the filters, raised the hatchet, and kicked the door open. I swung the light instantly to the far wall. The French doors were gone. They hadn't shattered. They'd been pushed open. The lock had snapped, and the doors were standing wide ajar. But I wasn't looking at the night sky. I was looking at a wall of pulsing black-green vegetation that had grown into the room. It had filled the entire space like expanding foam. The vines were thick as pythons, weaving together to form a solid mass that covered the floor, the dresser, the bed. It was humid in there, wet, hot. And in the center of the bed, in the center of the mass, something was growing. I stepped closer, mesmerized by the horror of it. A pod. It was the size of a watermelon, translucent and pale, hanging from a thick vine that had wrapped around the ceiling fan. Inside the pod, I could see a shadow moving, curling, uncurling. My bed was a nest. I stepped on a floorboard. Creak. The pod stopped moving. The vines on the floor, the ones wrapped around my dresser, suddenly stiffened. I wasn't alone in the room. To my left, near the walk-in closet, the vines shifted. A shape detached itself from the wall. It was humanoid, but wrong. It was made of bark and woven leaves, roughly the shape of a man, but with no face, just a smooth wooden surface where eyes should be. It was a creeper. That's what my brain named it in that split second. It turned its head toward me. It didn't have eyes, but it could sense me. Maybe the heat? Maybe the sound? It took a step. The sound was heavy, thud, like a log hitting the floor. I didn't think. I reacted. I slammed the door shut. Bam! I threw the deadbolt. A second later, crash! The wood of the door splintered outward. A fist, a wooden knotted fist, punched through the paneling just inches from my face. I scrambled back, falling on my ass in the hallway. The fist withdrew. Then came the scratching, furious, manic scratching at the wood. It was trying to tear the door down. I grabbed the duct tape, useless now. I grabbed the hammer. "No! No! No!" I yelled, scrambling to my feet. The door hinges groaned. The bottom hinge popped, a screw flying across the hallway and pinging off the wall. I couldn't fight that thing. It was made of solid wood. I had a hatchet and a hammer. I needed a barricade.
I grabbed the heavy linen closet door. It was a bifold, flimsy, useless. I ran to the bathroom door, ripped it open, and looked for anything heavy. The vanity? No, bolted down. I ran back to the hallway. The creature was tearing at the hole it had made. I could see the vines writhing through the gap. I did the only thing I could do. I retreated. I backed into the living room, the room with the toxic dust, the room with the leaking ceiling, and I slammed the hallway door between us. I was out of the bunker. I was back in the toxic zone, and now I was trapped between the poison air of the living room and the wooden golem in the hallway. I pressed my back against the door, feeling the impacts as the thing tried to break through the first door down the hall. My respirator hissed. I shone my light into the living room. The golden dust was thicker now. It swirled in the beam like a snow globe from hell. And on the couch, where the moss was growing, I saw them. More pods, smaller ones, dozens of them. They were hatching. I stood with my back against the door, the wood vibrating against my spine as the creeper in the hallway pounded on the other side. But I couldn't turn around. I couldn't go back. Because in front of me, the living room had become a nursery for nightmares. The golden dust was so thick now that my flashlight beam looked like a solid bar of light cutting through yellow fog. It swirled around the pods on the couch. There were maybe a dozen of them, ranging from the size of a grapefruit to the size of a football. They were pale, veiny, and pulsing in a rhythmic wet beat. Squelch. Tear. The sound came from the nearest pod, the one sitting on my leather recliner. I froze. I held my breath, fighting the urge to gasp into the respirator. The membrane of the pod split open. It didn't explode. It peeled back like a blooming flower, wet and sticky. Inside, curled into a tight ball, was something that looked like a crab made of thorns. It uncurled. It had too many legs. They were spindly, green, and tipped with black needles. It didn't have a face, just a cluster of sensory bulbs where a head should be. It was a thorn spider. That's the only name that fit. It chittered, a dry, rasping sound like sandpaper on wood, and crawled out of the pod. It tested the air with its front legs. Then, the pod next to it ripped open, and another, and another. They were waking up. I realized with a jolt of ice-cold terror that they were reacting to vibration, the pounding on the door behind me. The creeper was ringing the dinner bell. I had to cross the living room. I had to get to the laundry room, through to the garage. That was the only way up. The garage had a pull-down attic ladder. But the floor between me and the laundry room was covered in moss and prowled by these things. I lowered my center of gravity, crouching. I moved my flashlight beam away from them, aiming it at the floor just in front of my boots. Thud. The door behind me buckled. The spiders swiveled, all of them. They turned toward the noise, toward me. I took a step. My boot sank into the moss. It was silent. Good. I took another step. One of the spiders leaped. It didn't jump like a normal spider. It launched itself with hydraulic force. It hit the wall next to my head with a tock sound, embedding its legs into the drywall. It was blind. It was hunting by sound. I stood perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought the vibration alone would give me away. The spider on the wall remained motionless, waiting for a trigger. I moved my foot, sliding it through the moss instead of lifting it. Slide, slide. I made it past the sofa. The coffee table was a jungle of vines. I had to step over a root as thick as my arm. Crack! Behind me, The hallway door splintered. The creeper had punched a hole through the wood. The spiders went into a frenzy. They started skittering across the room, drawn to the noise at the door. They were swarming the noise. I used the chaos. I bolted. I didn't run. I lunged. 3 long strides across the mossy carpet. I hit the laundry room door, threw it open, dived inside, and slammed it shut. I heard the thwack, thwack, thwack of thorns embedding themselves in the wood on the other side, just as the latch clicked. I was safe for about 3 seconds.
I was back in the laundry room. The chemical smell of detergent was fighting a losing battle against the earthy stench of the invasion. I locked the door. It wouldn't hold the spiders forever, and it certainly wouldn't hold the creeper if it decided to follow me. I turned to the garage door, the heavy steel fire door I had fled from earlier. I didn't hesitate this time. I unlocked the deadbolt and shoved it open, stumbling back into the garage. It was still hot, still dry, still smelling of gasoline. I swung the flashlight up to the ceiling. There it was, the attic hatch, a rectangle of plywood framed in the drywall ceiling with a short pull string hanging down. It was 12 feet up. Damn it, I hissed. I couldn't reach the string. And the stepladder. Where was the stepladder? I scanned the garage. It was buried under a pile of gardening tools in the corner, tools that were now tangled in roots that had burst through the concrete floor. I didn't have time to dig it out. I looked at the Toyota, the crushed car. If I climbed onto the trunk, then onto the roof, I might be able to reach the string. I scrambled onto the trunk of the car. The metal groaned under my weight. The rear window was blown out, and I tried not to look into the back seat. I climbed onto the crushed roof. It was slick with dust. I stood up, balancing on the uneven metal. I reached up. My fingers brushed the string, just an inch too short. Boom! The laundry room door, the one I had just come through, shook with a metallic tang. The creeper was in the laundry room. It had smashed through the living room door and followed me. It was relentless. It was tracking me. I jumped. My fingers caught the knot at the end of the string. I yanked down with all my weight. Skirk! The rusty springs of the attic ladder screamed in the silence. The hatch popped open, and the wooden ladder slid down with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot. Dust, ancient, gray insulation dust, rained down on me. I scrambled off the car and onto the ladder. It wobbled. It was old wood, dry rotted. Hold, I begged. Just hold. I climbed. 1 rung, 2 rungs. The steel door to the laundry room flew open with a metallic clang. I looked down. The creeper stood in the doorway. In the flashlight beam, I saw it clearly for the first time. It was taller than a man, composed of twisted gray roots and bark. Its face was a knot of wood, but it had a mouth, a jagged vertical split that dripped sap. One of its arms ended in a cluster of sharp, broken branches. It tilted its head up. It saw me. It roared like a tree splitting in a storm and charged. I scrambled up the last few rungs, throwing myself into the attic. I grabbed the ladder and hauled it up. It was heavy. The springs fought me. The creeper leapt. Its branch claw raked the bottom rung of the ladder just as I pulled it out of reach. I slammed the hatch shut. It didn't have a lock. I looked around frantically. A box of old college textbooks, heavy. I dragged the box over and slammed it down on top of the hatch door. Then a box of Christmas ornaments. Then a spare tire I had stored up there for some reason. Thump! The hatch jumped. The boxes rattled. The thing was jumping up, hitting the ceiling. Thump! I backed away, crawling over the pink fiberglass insulation, gasping for air through my mask. I was in the attic. I was trapped between the roof and the monsters below, but I was higher. I was 1 step closer to the sky. The attic was an oven. If the house was hot, the attic was a kiln. The temperature must have been 120 degrees. The heat radiating off the roof shingles was immense. I lay on the wooden joists, trying to control my breathing. The respirator was suffocating me now. The sweat was running into my eyes, stinging. I wiped my goggles, smearing the dust. I listened to the thumping below. It was rhythmic now, determined, but the hatch was holding. The weight of the boxes kept it down. I shone my light around the attic. It was a forest of trusses, engineered wood beams angling up to the peak. But the forest outside had invaded here too. Roots had pierced through the plywood of the roof decking. They hung down like stalactites, dripping that dark, viscous sap onto the insulation. The air glittered with fiberglass particles and pollen. I had to get out. I had to get to the roof. I crawled toward the center of the attic, moving carefully along the joists so I wouldn't put a foot through the drywall ceiling. Rip. Tear. I froze. The sound was coming from above me. I shone the light up. The roof decking, the plywood sheets that held the shingles, were sagging. The roots from the massive trees outside were pushing down. The wood was splintering. I realized then that the house wasn't just being crushed, it was being digested. The roots were breaking it down, turning it into mulch. I needed an exit. My house didn't have a roof hatch. Why would it? It's a suburban ranch. But it had a gable vent. At the far end of the attic, above the garage wall, there was a triangular louvered vent to let air flow through. It was wood, painted white. That was my door. I started crawling toward it. The insulation was itchy, working its way through my clothes. My knees were raw. I made it to the gable end. The vent was about 2 feet wide, big enough. I hit it with the hammer. Whack! The slats broke. Sunlight, faint green-tinted sunlight, poured in. Fresh air? No, but outside air. I smashed the rest of the slats out, clearing the frame. I stuck my head out. I was looking out over the driveway, or where the driveway used to be. Below me, the world was unrecognizable. The cul-de-sac was a canyon of green. The trees had grown hundreds of feet tall, their canopies interlocking to form a solid ceiling. But here, near the eaves, there was a gap. I could climb out onto the roof from here. I pulled myself through the hole, scraping my stomach on the rough wood. I dangled for a second, then swung my leg up, catching the edge of the gutter. The gutter groaned. It was thick, mossy sludge. I hauled myself up and rolled onto the shingles. I lay there, staring up. I expected to see the sky. I wanted to see the sky, but I didn't. I saw the web. Above the roof, stretching from tree to massive tree, was a canopy so thick it blocked the stars. But it wasn't just leaves, it was woven. Vines, thick as suspension cables, crisscrossed the space above the neighborhood. And walking on those vines, silhouetted against the faint moonlight filtering through, were shapes. Large, multi-legged shapes. The spiders. The big ones. The mothers. I was on the roof. I was out of the house, but I wasn't free. I was just on a different layer of the jungle. And I was completely exposed. I lay flat on my back on the shingles, my chest heaving against the asphalt, staring up at a sky that wasn't there anymore. I had fought so hard to get out, to get up. I thought if I could just breach the roof, I would find air. I would find the stars. I would find a horizon. But there is no horizon. Not anymore. The trees, the oaks, the maples, the pines that used to line our pleasant suburban streets, they hadn't just grown tall. They had become titans. Their trunks were like skyscrapers, dark columns rising hundreds of feet into the air. And up there, high above the rooftops, their branches had locked together. It was a ceiling, a solid interlocking canopy of black leaves and thick ropey vines. It completely blocked out the moon. It blocked out the stars. It sealed the neighborhood inside a massive organic biodome. And in that canopy, things were moving. I watched, frozen in terror, as a shape silhouetted against a patch of faint bioluminescence crawled across the underside of the leaves. It was massive, the size of a cargo van. It moved with a slow, hydraulic grace, 8 legs, a bulbous abdomen. It was spinning something. A line of silk as thick as a towing cable glittered in the gloom. It was knitting the trees together, sealing the cracks. "They're farming us," I whispered into my mask. The thought just appeared in my brain, cold and absolute. This wasn't random growth. This was a system. The vines crushed the houses, the roots turned the soil, the pollen subdued the prey, and the things up there, they were building the cage. I carefully rolled onto my stomach. I couldn't look at them anymore. If they looked down, if they saw me. I looked at my roof. It was an island in a sea of green. The shingles were covered in a slick, velvet-like moss that glowed with a faint radioactive blue tint. The gutters were overflowing with vines that dangled down into the darkness of the yard like unkempt hair. To my left, the chimney stood like a tombstone. To my right, the steep slope down to the backyard. I was exposed, completely, utterly exposed. Inside the house, I was trapped, but I was hidden. Here, I was a speck on a black slate, waiting to be picked off. I needed cover. I crawled toward the chimney. The moss was slippery, greasy almost. My boots scrambled for purchase. Slip, scrape. I froze. Did the things above hear that? I waited. High above, the chittering continued, a sound like dry branches breaking, but no reaction. They were too high up. They weren't hunting mice. They were hunting. I didn't want to know what they were hunting. I reached the chimney and pressed my back against the brickwork. It was still warm from the heat of the house below. I hugged it, closing my eyes, trying to center myself. I was out. I was alive. Now what?
8:45 p.m. I sat by the chimney for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes. I needed a plan. I checked my supplies. The flashlight, battery getting low. The hatchet, the hammer, the water. I had 2 bottles in my pockets. The rest was in the bag I'd left. Where? My stomach dropped. The tote bag, the tools, the food. I had left them in the garage. When I climbed the ladder, I had the hatchet on my belt and the hammer in my hand, but the bag? I left it on the hood of the Toyota. I squeezed my eyes shut. Stupid, stupid. I had no food. I had a quart of water, and I was on a roof. Okay, I muttered. Okay, assess. I looked out over the neighborhood. From this vantage point, I could see the peaks of the other houses protruding from the sea of vines like sinking ships. Mrs. Gable's house across the street was gone, just a mound of ivy. The Chen's house next door, the roof had collapsed. I could see the jagged rafters sticking up like broken ribs. But 3 houses down, the Anderson place. The Andersons were intense people. He was an ex-Marine, she was a nurse. They had a generator, they had solar panels. They were the people we made fun of at block parties for having a bunker mentality. I squinted through the gloom. Their roof was clear. Not just clear, it looked clean. And on their chimney, there was a light.
It wasn't a steady light. It was a strobe, a harsh white xenon flash. Flash, 2 seconds of darkness. Flash, 2 seconds of darkness. It was cutting through the gloom, illuminating the mist that hung over the street. "They're alive," I said. The relief was so sharp it almost hurt. If the strobe was running, they had power. If they had power, they had a generator or their solar was working. If they were signaling, they were looking for survivors. I had to get there. It was 3 houses away, maybe 100 yards. But between me and that light was a gap filled with 40-foot drops, aggressive vegetation, and the things that prowled the ground. Could I cross the roofs? I looked at the gap between my house and the Kowalskis next door. It was about 8 feet, doable for a track star. For an architect in heavy boots wearing a respirator? Maybe. But the Kowalskis' roof was steep and covered in that blue moss. I needed signal back. I needed them to know I was coming, or at least that someone saw them. I raised my flashlight. I aimed it at the strobe light. I waited for their flash. Flash. I clicked my light on. 1, 2, 3. Off. I waited. Flash. The strobe stopped. My heart hammered. Did they see it? Then the strobe changed pattern. Flash, flash, flash. Rapid fire. Then a pause. Flash, flash, flash. Acknowledgement. I almost cried. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Standing there on that roof, surrounded by monsters, that blinking light was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was language. It was humanity. But then I heard a sound that froze the tears in my ducts. Hiss. Not from the ground, not from the sky, from the gutter of my own roof. The light, my flashlight beam, it hadn't just attracted the neighbors. Light is a beacon. I knew that. But I forgot that in nature, bioluminescence usually means one of 2 things. I am poison, or I am food. To the thing climbing up my downspout, my flashlight meant food. I heard the metal of the gutter groan. The aluminum crumpled like foil. I scrambled back, away from the edge, putting the chimney between me and the sound. I clicked the light off, plunging myself back into the semi-darkness. A shape pulled itself over the edge of the roof. It wasn't a spider. It wasn't a creeper. It was sleek. It looked like a wolf, if a wolf had no skin, only woven muscle fibers made of green vines. It had a long snout-like protrusion, but no mouth, just a mass of writhing tendrils where the face should be. It moved on 4 legs, low to the shingles, stalking. A vine wolf. It shook itself like a dog shaking off water. A cloud of yellow pollen puffed out of its fur. It turned its head. It scanned the roof. I held my breath. I pressed myself into the corner where the chimney met the roof slope. I was a shadow. I was a brick. The creature took a step. Its paws didn't make a sound. It had pads of soft moss. It was sniffing. Sniff, sniff. The sound was wet. It was smelling the air. The wind shifted. A gentle breeze blew across the roof, from me, toward it. The creature's head snapped toward the chimney. The tendrils on its face flared open like a blooming flower, revealing a hollow, dark cavity throat. It let out a sound, a high-pitched tea kettle shriek. It knew I was there. It charged. I didn't think. I moved. I swung the hatchet, not at the creature. It was too fast. I swung it at the chimney flashing, sparking it, trying to scare it? No, useless. I scrambled up. I climbed the chimney itself. The creature hit the bricks below me, snapping its jaws or whatever they were, inches from my boot. I hauled myself up onto the chimney cap. It was a tiny perch, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet. The creature scrabbled at the bricks. Its claws, long wooden thorns, scraped against the masonry. It was trying to climb up. I looked down at it. It was snarling, thrashing. I looked at the hatchet in my hand. "Come on," I yelled. My voice sounded tinny in the mask. "Come on!" It leaped. It possessed incredible strength. It launched itself vertically, aiming for my legs. I swung the hatchet down with everything I had. Thwack! The blade buried itself in the creature's shoulder. It didn't feel like hitting meat. It felt like chopping into a wet log. The creature shrieked. It fell back, dragging the hatchet out of my hand. "No!" I shouted, reaching for it. The hatchet clattered on the shingles, then slid down the roof, disappearing over the edge. The creature landed on the roof, rolling. It was wounded. Green sap was spurting from the gash in its shoulder. It snarled, backing away, favoring its left leg. It looked at me on the chimney. Then it looked at the edge of the roof where the hatchet had gone. It decided I wasn't worth the effort, or maybe it was just hurt. It turned and slunk away, disappearing down the other side of the roof, back into the shadows. I sat on the chimney cap, shaking uncontrollably. I had lost my hatchet, my primary weapon. I had a hammer and a flashlight and a neighbor with a light. I looked toward the Anderson house. The strobe was still blinking. Flash, flash, flash. It was calling me. But to get there, I had to get off this chimney. I had to cross the roof. I had to jump the gap. And I knew with absolute certainty that the vine wolf wasn't the only thing hunting on the rooftops tonight. I looked at my hands. They were bleeding, not red blood, green. I stared at the palm of my glove. There was a smear of green sap where I had touched the creature, where the roof, and where the sap touched the fabric of my glove. The fabric was fraying, dissolving. It wasn't just blood, it was acid. I frantically ripped the glove off and threw it away. I checked my skin, red, irritated, but unbroken. "Don't touch them," I whispered. "Don't touch anything." I looked at the gap between the houses again. It was time to move before the wolf came back with a pack.
9:15 p.m. I was still sitting on the chimney cap, hugging the brickwork. My breath was fogging the visor of my respirator with every exhalation. I looked at my right hand, the one without the glove. It felt naked, vulnerable. In this new world, skin was a liability. One scratch, one touch of that acidic sap, one spore entering a pore, and who knew what would happen? I pulled my sleeve down over my knuckles, making a makeshift mitten. I looked at the gap again. My roof to the Kowalski's roof. 8 feet of empty air. Below that, a 20-foot drop into a dark alleyway between the houses that was choked with briars. 8 feet. In a gym, on a track, 8 feet is nothing. A stand-and broad jump for an average male is maybe 7 feet. A run-and jump, easy. But I wasn't in a gym. I was wearing heavy work boots. I was dehydrated. I was exhausted. And the runway, my roof, was covered in that bioluminescent blue moss. I tested the moss with my boot. It was slick, like wet velvet or algae on a river rock. If I tried to sprint, I'd slip. If I slipped, I'd slide off the edge and break my neck in the briars. But if I stayed here, the vine wolf would come back, or the cold would get me, or the thirst. I had to jump. I climbed down from the chimney. My boots crunched on the shingles. I moved to the edge of the roof, looking across. The Kowalski's roof was slightly lower than mine. That was good. Gravity was on my side. I backed up to the ridge of my roof. I had about 12 feet of runway. Don't run, I told myself. Fast walk, controlled steps, then launch. I visualized the arc. An architect's brain is a curse sometimes. I saw the trajectory. I saw the force vectors. I saw the margin of error. I took a deep breath. I focused on the Anderson strobe light in the distance. Flash, flash, flash. On 3, I whispered.
1, 2, 3. I moved. Step, step, step. My boots gripped the moss. I hit the edge of the roof. I drove my left leg down, exploding upward. For a second, I was weightless. The air rushed past my ears. I was flying over the alleyway, suspended between two burning ships. I hit the Kowalski's roof. My feet landed, but the moss gave way instantly. It sheared off the shingles like a loose rug. Wham! My legs went out from under me. I slammed chest first onto the roof. The air left my lungs in a violent whoosh. I was sliding. The momentum carried me down the slope of the roof toward the backyard. I clawed at the shingles. My bare hand scraped against the grit, tearing skin. My hammer caught on a gutter nail, jerked my belt, then came loose. "No!" I gasped. I kicked my boots, trying to find friction. My feet went over the edge. I stopped. I was hanging off the eaves of the Kowalski house, my chest pressed against the shingles, my hands gripping the rough asphalt, my legs dangling in the void. I lay there, hyperventilating. The moss under my cheek smelled sweet, like rotten melons. I pulled. My shoulders screamed. I kicked my leg up, hooking a heel over the gutter. The gutter held. I rolled myself back onto the roof, crawling on hands and knees away from the edge, shaking so hard my teeth rattled against the respirator mouthpiece. I had made the jump, but I had left skin on the shingles and blood, and I knew now that the blood would call them.
I crawled to the peak of the Kowalski roof. I needed to get my bearings. The Anderson house, the lighthouse, was still 2 jumps away. Between me and them was the Chen house. I looked toward the Chen house. My heart sank. The Chen house had suffered a catastrophic structural failure. A massive oak tree had fallen directly onto it, splitting the house in half like a piece of firewood. The roof wasn't a surface anymore. It was a jagged crater of splintered rafters and collapsed drywall. I couldn't jump onto that. It was unstable, a death trap. I was stuck on the Kowalski roof. I sat there, despair rising in my chest like bile. Think, Elias, think. I looked down at the roof I was sitting on. The Kowalskis had installed skylights a few years ago, 2 big Velux windows over their living room. I was sitting right next to one. I wiped the blue moss away from the glass with my sleeve. The glass was intact. I shone my flashlight down into the house. The beam cut through the darkness of their living room. It wasn't a living room anymore. It was a terrarium. The furniture was gone, consumed by a carpet of thick, lush ferns. The walls were covered in pulsating, bioluminescent fungi that glowed with a soft purple light. And in the center of the room were the Kowalskis. I recoiled, choking back a scream. They weren't dead. Well, they weren't corpses. Mr. and Mrs. Kowalski were sitting on what used to be their sofa. They were fused to it. Vines had wrapped around their legs, their torsos, their necks. But it was worse than that. Plants were growing out of them. A beautiful, vibrant orchid with red petals was blooming from Mr. Kowalski's open mouth. His eyes were wide, milky white, staring up at the skylight, staring at me. Mrs. Kowalski, her skin had turned the texture of bark. Her hands, resting on her lap, had elongated, her fingers turning into roots that dug into the cushions. They looked peaceful. That was the most horrifying part. They didn't look like they had struggled. They just looked like they had just sat down
and let the garden take them. As I watched, a small thorn spider scuttled across Mrs. Kowalski's face. It paused on her cheek, then moved on. She didn't blink. I turned off the light. I couldn't look at it. I couldn't. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I had to keep moving. I couldn't end up like that, a planter box for the new world. I looked back at the Chen house, the ruin, the fallen tree, the massive oak that had crushed their home. Its trunk was huge, maybe 5 feet wide. It lay across the wreckage, bridging the gap between the backyard and the front yard, and its upper branches stretched out toward the Anderson house. It was a bridge. If I could get onto that tree trunk, I could walk across the ruin of the Chen house, climb through the branches, and maybe jump to the Anderson roof. But to get to the tree, I had to get off this roof. I crawled to the edge facing the Chen house. The tree trunk was close, maybe 4 feet away from the Kowalski eaves. But the tree wasn't dead. It was fallen, yes, but its roots were still in the ground, and it was still growing. The bark was shifting, moving like skin over muscle. I stood up. My legs felt shaky. Don't look down. Look at the bark. I stepped to the edge.
The gap was small, 4 feet, a hop. I hopped. I landed on the massive trunk of the fallen oak tree. It felt wrong instantly. Standing on a normal log feels solid, dead. Standing on this tree felt like standing on the back of a sleeping whale. It was warm. It had a pulse. I could feel a slow, rhythmic thumping coming up through the soles of my boots. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. The tree was pumping sap, massive gallons of it rushing through the cambium layers just inches below my feet. I crouched down, keeping my center of gravity low. The bark was rough, deeply, deeply furrowed. Good for grip. I started to walk along the trunk, moving over the wreckage of the Chen house. Below me, jagged shards of wood and drywall stuck up like spears. If I fell, I'd be skewered. I kept my eyes on the Anderson house. The strobe was brighter now. Flash, flash, flash. I could see the outline of the chimney. I could see the silhouette of a person standing next to the light. A person? "Hey!" I yelled. "I'm coming!" My voice was muffled by the mask, lost in the vastness of the canopy. The figure didn't react. They just kept staring out into the dark. I moved faster. The trunk narrowed as I got closer to the branches. Suddenly, the tree shuddered. I dropped to one knee, grabbing a branch for stability. Screech! A vibration ran through the wood. I shone my light down the length of the trunk, back toward the root ball. Something was climbing onto the tree from the ground. It was the size of a bear, but low to the bark. It had 6 legs and a carapace that shimmered like oil. A beetle. A stag beetle, but mutated. Its mandibles were the size of scythes. It was blocking my retreat. Not that I could go back anyway. It started to march down the trunk toward me. It wasn't fast, but it was inevitable. It clicked as it walked, its legs punching little holes in the bark. I turned and scrambled. "Go, go, go!" I hissed. I reached the canopy of the fallen tree. The trunk split into 3 massive branches here. One of them reached out, touching the gutter of the Anderson house. It was a narrow path, maybe 8 inches wide. I stepped onto the branch. It bowed under my weight. Behind me, the clicking got louder. The beetle was gaining. I balanced, arms out, walking the tightrope. The branch bounced with every step. 10 feet to the roof. 5 feet. The branch tapered. It was getting too thin to hold me. It started to crack. Snap.
I lunged. I threw myself across the last 3 feet of air, aiming for the Anderson's gutter. My chest hit the metal. My hands scrambled for grip on the shingles. The branch I had been standing on snapped completely and fell away, crashing into the ruin below. I pulled myself up. I rolled onto the Anderson's roof. I was there. I stood up, waving my flashlight. "I'm here! I made it!" I looked toward the chimney, toward the strobe light. The figure was there. A man. He was wearing tactical gear, holding a rifle. He was looking right at me. But he wasn't smiling. He wasn't waving. He raised the rifle. He aimed it at my chest. "Stop! Do not advance! Confirm infection status!" I froze, hands up. "I'm clean! I'm clean!" "Take off the mask," the ordered. "Let me see your face." I hesitated. The air, the pollen. "Take it off or I drop you right now." I reached up. My hands were shaking. I unbuckled the straps. I pulled the respirator off. The night air hit my face. It smelled of ozone and crushed flowers. I took a breath. "I'm human," I choked out. "I'm Elias." The man lowered the rifle slightly, but he didn't lower his guard. "Check your skin. Any green? Any sap?" I looked at my bare hand, the one I had scraped on the Kowalski roof. The blood wasn't red anymore. The scrape on my palm, it was glowing, a faint, pulsing bioluminescent blue. I stared at it. I stammered. The man saw the glow. Even from 20 feet away, he saw it. He raised the rifle again. "I'm sorry, son," he said.
The barrel of the rifle was a black eye, staring unblinking at my chest. I stood on the shingles, hands raised, the night wind cooling the sweat on my face. My right hand, the one with the glowing blue smear across the palm, pulsed with a faint rhythmic light. "Wait!" I screamed. My voice cracked. I hadn't spoken at full volume to another human being in... how long? "It's not me. It's the moss. I slipped on the roof next door." Anderson didn't lower the weapon. His finger tightened on the trigger guard. He was wearing night vision goggles flipped up on his helmet, and his eyes beneath them were hard, calculating. He wasn't looking at me like a neighbor. He was looking at me like a vector. "That's how it starts," Anderson said. His voice was calm, terrifyingly steady. "Contact transfer. Spores enter the bloodstream. Incubation is less than an hour. Then you become a garden." "I'm lucid," I pleaded. "I'm talking to you. I jumped the gap. I fought off a wolf. Would one of them do that?" "The infected are clever. They mimic." He adjusted his stance. He was going to take the shot. I saw it in his shoulders. "Frank!" A woman's voice cut through the noise of the wind. The sliding glass door behind him, the roof access, slid open. A woman stepped out. She was wearing scrubs and a tactical vest, holding a spotlight. Sarah Anderson. "Frank, wait," she said. She shone the light directly on me, blinding me for a second. "Let me see the hand." "He's glowing, Sarah," Frank snapped. "Protocol is clear." "Protocol is for confirmed conversion," she said firmly. She stepped past him, walking out onto the dangerous slope of the roof without hesitation. "Let me see." She stopped 10 feet away. "Elias, that you?" Yes, it's me." "Show me the palm, slowly." I turned my hand over. The blue slime was smeared across the heel of my hand and my knuckles. The skin underneath was raw and red from the shingles, but the glow was sitting on top of the blood, not coming from inside the veins. "It's surface contamination," I said, desperate hope making my words rush out. "Look, I can scrape it off. Look, I reached for my belt, realized I lost my hatchet, and frantically wiped my hand on my jeans. The blue slime smeared onto the denim. The glow transferred.
My skin was red, bleeding, but dark, normal. Sarah looked at Frank. It transferred. It's not systemic yet. Yet, Frank said. We have the decontamination unit, Sarah said. We can scrub him. If he turns, we handle it in the tank, but we don't shoot a neighbor on the roof unless we have to. Frank stared at me for a long 5 seconds. He was weighing the bullet against the risk. Finally, he exhaled. He lowered the barrel about 2 inches. Move to the door, hands visible. If you twitch, if you cough, if you look at me wrong, I put you down. Clear? Clear, I whispered. I walked past him. I could smell the gun oil on his rifle. I could smell the fear radiating off him, masked by discipline. I stepped through the sliding door and into the Andersons' attic.
I expected to walk into a house. I walked into a plastic tunnel. They had sealed off the upper floor. Heavy, clear construction plastic was taped floor to ceiling, creating a corridor that led from the roof door to a bathroom. The air smelled strongly of bleach and chlorine, a sharp, stinging contrast to the earthy rot outside. "Into the tub," Sarah ordered, pointing. The bathroom was stripped. No shower curtain, no mats, no towels. Just the porcelain tub and a garden hose run through the window, hooked up to a pump system. "Strip," Frank said from the doorway. He was still aiming the rifle at me. "Everything?" "Everything. The clothes are compromised, the boots, the belt, all of it goes in the bag." He kicked a heavy-duty trash bag toward me. I didn't argue. I stripped out of my jeans, my sweat-soaked shirt, my boots. I shoved them into the bag. I stood there, naked, shivering, bleeding, and exhausted in my neighbor's bathroom. Sarah stepped in. She was wearing heavy rubber gloves and a face shield now. She held a jug of industrial bleach and a stiff, bristled scrub brush. "This is gonna hurt," she said. It wasn't a threat. It was an apology. She turned on the hose. The water was ice cold. "Scrub," she commanded. "Everywhere, especially the hands, until you bleed. We have to get the spores out of the abrasion." I scrubbed. I poured the bleach over my raw hands. The pain was blinding. It felt like liquid fire eating into my nerves. I screamed. I couldn't help it. I fell to my knees in the tub, gasping, tears mixing with the bleach water. "Harder," Frank yelled. "Get that blue off." I scrubbed until the water swirling down the drain turned from pink to red. I scrubbed until I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. Sarah stepped forward. "Okay, that's enough. Rinse." She sprayed me down with the hose. The cold water shocked my system, keeping me from passing out. She handed me a towel and a set of gray sweats. "Get dressed. We're moving you to the holding cell." "Holding cell?" I chattered, my teeth clicking. "Guest room," Frank said. "Reinforced door. You stay there for 24 hours. If you don't sprout leaves by tomorrow night, you're part of the crew." I dried off, the towel rough against my chemically burned skin. I pulled on the sweats. They were too big, but they were dry. They were clean. I stepped out of the bathroom. Frank backed up, keeping distance. "Downstairs," he said. We walked down the hallway. The Anderson house was unrecognizable. The windows were boarded up with 2x4s and sheet metal. Wires ran along the floor. Battery banks were stacked in corners. They led me to the guest bedroom on the first floor. Frank opened the door. "Bucket for a toilet, water jug, protein bar. We'll be watching on the baby monitor." He pointed to a camera taped to the dresser. "Frank," I said, stopping in the doorway. "Thank you." He didn't smile. "Don't thank me yet. If you turn, I'm the one who has to come in there and finish it."
He slammed the door. I heard the heavy thunk of a deadbolt sliding home, then a second lock, then a chair being wedged under the knob. I was trapped again, but this time the monsters were on the outside.
I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, staring at my hands. They were raw, red, and smelling of chlorine. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the vine wolf lunging. I saw Mr. Kowalski with the orchid growing out of his throat. I watched the sun come up through the cracks in the boarded window, a thin sliver of gray light. Day 2 in the bunker. Day, 6 of the apocalypse? At 8 a.m., the lock clicked. Sarah opened the door. She wasn't wearing the face shield anymore. She looked tired. Her eyes were rimmed with red. "You didn't turn," she said softly. "I didn't turn," I confirmed. "Come on, Frank wants to brief you." I followed her into the kitchen. If the rest of the house was a bunker, the kitchen was command central. The island was covered in maps, topographical maps of the county, street maps of our neighborhood. There were 3 ham radios set up on the counter, buzzing with static and low voices. A laptop was open, running off a solar battery bank, displaying a grainy radar loop. Frank was standing over a map, drinking coffee from a thermos. He looked up. "Sit," he said. I sat on a bar stool. Sarah put a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me. Powdered eggs. I ate them like they were a Michelin star meal. "What is this place?" I asked, gesturing to the radios. "Listening post. I was Signal Corps before I was infantry. I've been monitoring the band since the first alert." "What do you know?" I asked. "Is help coming?" Frank laughed. It was a dry, bitter sound. "Help." He walked over to the map. He picked up a red marker. "This is us," he said, circling our neighborhood. "This is the city center." He drew a big circle around the downtown area. "This is the interstate." He drew a thick red line across the map, cutting us off from the north. "The military isn't coming to help, Elias. They've established a containment line, the Ashburn line, 30 miles north." "Containment?" I asked. "You mean quarantine?" "I mean a kill box," Frank said. "Everything south of that line is designated hostile flora. They aren't sending rescue trucks. They're sending incendiaries." My blood ran cold. "They're going to burn us?" "They're already doing it," Sarah said quietly, tuning one of the radios. "Listen." She turned the volume up. Through the static, a voice cut through. "Pilots. Target Sector 4 Alpha. Drop confirmed. Napalm is effective. Canopy density is reducing, moving to secondary." "They're firebombing the perimeter," Frank said, "trying to stop the spread, but the growth rate is too fast. The roots are going under the fire breaks. So they're pulling back. They're going to widen the zone." He looked at me. "They're going to glass this entire county, Elias, to save the rest of the state." I stared at the map, the red line, the circle around our house. "So we're dead. If the plants don't get us, the Air Force will." "Not if we move," Frank said. He tapped a spot on the map, way past the red line, a mountain ridge. "There's a gap in the canopy here, a reservoir. If we can get to the water, we can use a boat to bypass the root systems. We can get across the line before the next bombing run." "When is the next run?" I asked. Frank looked at his watch. 72 hours, maybe less. He leaned forward, his hands on the counter. "We have food, we have weapons, but we don't have a navigator. I can shoot, Sarah can patch holes, but looking at your hands, you're an architect, right? You told me that once at a barbecue." "Yeah, I'm an architect." "Good, because the streets are gone, the bridges are gone. We have to move through the infrastructure, sewers, maintenance tunnels,
the guts of the city. I have the blueprints from the city archives. Don't ask how I got them, but I can't read them like you can." He slid a heavy roll of blueprints across the granite island. "You want to live, Elias? You want to survive the verdant purge?" He pulled a knife and stabbed it into the map, right on the reservoir. "Get us out of this neighborhood. Get us to the water. Do that, and we all walk away. Fail, and we become fertilizer." I looked at the blueprints. I looked at the red marker line. I looked at my raw, scrubbed hands. I took a breath. "Show me the tunnel schematics," I said.
The kitchen island became our world. The perimeter of that granite slab was the only territory we controlled. Outside the boarded windows, the forest was digesting the neighborhood. Inside, we were planning a jailbreak. I unrolled the blueprints. They were old, municipal copies, smelling of ammonia and dust. Stormwater management and sanitation, Sector 4. "Here," I said, tracing a blue line with my finger. My hand was shaking slightly. The tremors from the bleach scrub hadn't fully subsided. "This is the main trunk line. It runs directly under Oak Ridge Drive." Frank leaned in, his face illuminated by the harsh light of the LED lantern. Diameter: 12-foot concrete pipe, big enough to drive a truck through. It was built in the 90s to handle the flood runoff from the hills. I traced the line north. It connects to the old spillway here, near the industrial park. Then it feeds into the reservoir system. "The industrial park is past the fire line," Sarah noted, looking at the tactical map. "If we pop out there, we're in the clear." "It's not that simple," I said. "This is a gravity-fed system. It goes down. We're going to be descending about 80 feet below surface level. And here," I tapped a junction point, "there's a flow regulator, a gate. If it's closed, we're stuck. We'd have to manually crank it open." "Can we open it?" Frank asked. "If the gears aren't rusted shut or crushed by roots." That was the elephant in the room, or rather, the tree in the room. "Frank," I said, looking up at him, "roots seek water. That's biology 101. These pipes are full of water. The trees outside, their roots are going to be wrapping these pipes, crushing them, piercing them. So, the tunnels might be breached. We might get down there and find it's not a highway. It might be a root cellar, a flooded, infested root cellar." Frank chewed his lip. He looked at the map, then at the clock. "We don't have a choice. The surface is impassable. The canopy is too dense for travel, and the aerial bombardment starts in 68 hours. The tunnel is the only route that gives us cover." He straightened up. "We leave at 1400 hours. That gives us 2 hours to prep. Sarah, pack the medical kits. Iodine, bandages, antifungals. Elias, you're with me in the garage. We need to get you out of those sweatpants and into something that can stop a thorn." I looked at the blueprints one last time. The blue lines looked like veins. We were injecting ourselves into the bloodstream of a dying city, hoping the infection hadn't reached the heart yet. The Anderson garage was an armory. Frank had been preparing for the end of the world a long time. I used to think he was paranoid. Now, standing in front of a pegboard wall of tactical gear, I realized he was just early. "Put this on," he said, tossing me a heavy vest. It wasn't Kevlar. It was canvas, reinforced with thick leather patches. "Standard bite gear," he grunted. "Made it myself. Kevlar stops bullets, but it doesn't stop needles. Thick leather does." I strapped it on. It smelled of beeswax and oil. It was heavy, restricting my movement, but it felt like a hug, a shield. Next came the shin guards, hard plastic catcher's gear, painted matte black. Then the gloves, welding gauntlets that went up to my elbows. Boots, he pointed to a pair of military-issue combat boots. Steel toe, steel shank in the sole,
Don't want anything piercing your foot from below. I laced him up tight. I stood up, feeling like a medieval knight preparing for a siege. Weapon? Frank asked. I looked at my hands. I had a hatchet. I lost it. Frank nodded. He reached into a gun safe. He pulled out a short-barreled shotgun, pump action, matte black. Mossberg 500, 12 gauge, loaded with dragon's breath. Dragon's breath? Incendiary rounds, magnesium pellets. It burns at 3,000 degrees. You shoot a plant with this, it doesn't just make a hole, it catches fire. But be careful. You fire this in a confined space, you'll cook yourself. Use it only if they swarm. He handed me the weapon. It was heavy, cold, and lethal. I checked the safety. I've never shot a person, I said quietly. Good thing we're not shooting people, Frank said, loading a pistol for himself. We're gardening. He handed me a machete and a sheath. This is for the vines. The gun is for the things living in the vines. He looked me in the eye. Elias, listen to me. Down there, it's going to be tight, it's going to be dark, and it's going to be loud. The acoustics in a concrete pipe amplify everything. If you panic, you die. If you freeze, you die. You follow my lead, you read the map, you keep moving. Understood? Understood. Good. Sarah, he yelled. We moving? Sarah appeared in the doorway. She was geared up too. Tactical vest, helmet, a medical pack that looked heavy enough to break a spine. She carried a carbine rifle slung across her chest. Ready, she said. All right, Frank said. Insertion point is the storm drain access on the corner of Oak and Pine, 2 blocks east. 2 blocks. It sounded so close. In the old world, that was a 3-minute walk to get the mail. Now, it was an expedition into the heart of darkness.
We stood around the open manhole, looking down. It was a throat, a dark concrete throat leading into the belly of the city. The smell rising from it wasn't sewage, it was rot. Wet, stagnant, swampy rot. Frank dropped a glow stick. We watched it fall. 1, 2, 3. It hit the water below with a splash. The green light illuminated the bottom. Reflecting water. Flowing water. It's not dry, Sarah said. The level is high. Knee-deep, Frank estimated. Manageable. He looked at me. Navigator first. My stomach dropped. Me? You need to read the markings on the walls. If we take a wrong turn down there, we don't come back up. You lead, I cover. Sarah watches the rear. He was right, but the idea of being the first one down that ladder. I slung the shotgun across my back. I checked my flashlight. I checked my mask seal. Okay, I said. Okay. I sat on the edge of the melted asphalt. I swung my legs into the hole. My boots found the iron rungs of the ladder. They were slick with slime. I started to climb down. The light from the surface began to fade. The air grew cooler, damper. The sound of the wind in the trees was replaced by the echo of dripping water. I reached to the bottom. My boots splashed into the water. It was cold. It came up to my shins. I unslung the shotgun and raised my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. It was a concrete tube, 12 feet wide, stretching out into infinity in both directions. The walls were covered in dripping slime. And on the ceiling of the pipe, roots. Millions of them. Tiny hair-like white roots hanging down like stalactites, brushing the top of my helmet. They were searching for the water. Clear, I whispered into the mic. Coming down, Frank said. I waited in the dark, gun raised, listening to the water flowing past my legs. And then I heard it, deep in the tunnel, maybe a mile away, or maybe just around the curve. Splash, splash, splash. Something was walking toward us.
There is no darkness like underground darkness. On the surface, even on the darkest night, there's starlight. There's the faint ambient glow of the atmosphere. But down here, in the concrete throat of the city, the darkness is heavy. It has weight. It presses against your eyes, trying to force them closed. I stood in the shin-deep water, shotgun raised, listening to the splashing echo fade into silence. Clink, splash. Frank landed behind me. Then Sarah. "Status," Frank whispered. His voice was right in my ear, transmitted through the headset, clear and digital, contrasting with the acoustic echo of the tunnel. I heard movement. 12 o'clock, maybe 100 yards out. It stopped. Frank moved up beside me. His shoulder brushed mine. In the narrow confines of the beam, I saw his rifle sweep the darkness. "Light discipline," Frank ordered. "Red filters only. White light blinds us and attracts them." We clicked our flashlights over to red mode. The tunnel instantly transformed from a gray concrete tube into a bloody, pulsating artery. The water looked like oil. The roots hanging from the ceiling looked like torn muscle fibers. "Elias, lead," Frank said. "Count the station markers. We need junction 4 Alpha." I stepped forward. The water resistance made every step a slow-motion lunge. Sloop, splash, sloop, splash. The ceiling was the problem. The roots I had seen earlier weren't just random strands. As we moved deeper, they became a curtain, a veil. Thousands of white hair-like rootlets hung down from the pipe joints, dangling into the water. We had to push through them. They brushed against my helmet, my face shield, my shoulders. They were sticky. They clung to the tactical vest. "Don't let them snag you," Sarah warned from the rear. "If they get a grip, they pull." I swatted them away with the barrel of the shotgun. I looked at the wall, stenciled in fading black paint on the curved concrete. Station 302. "Station 302, I reported. "We need to get to 310 before the turn." We walked for 10 minutes. The only sounds were the sloshing water and the rhythmic hiss-click of our respirators. Then, the smell hit us, even through the filters. It wasn't rot anymore. It was sweet, sickly, cloying vanilla and ammonia. "Pollen count rising." Sarah checked a gauge on her wrist. "Filters are holding, but it's thick here." I stopped. In front of us, the tunnel was blocked. Not by a wall, but by a bloom. A massive, fleshy flower, roughly the size of a tractor tire, was growing out of the side of the pipe. It was pulsating, expanding and contracting like a lung. It blocked 2/3 of the walkway. "What is that?" I asked. "Bioblockage. Don't touch it. Squeeze past. Hug the right wall." I moved to the right. The concrete was slick with algae. I pressed my back against the curve of the pipe, sliding sideways. The flower was inches from my face shield. I could see the pores on its petals opening and closing. I held my breath, sliding past. My utility belt scraped against the concrete. Scrape. The flower reacted. It shuddered. A cloud of yellow dust puffed out of its center, right into my face. The dust hit my visor. It coated the plastic instantly. I couldn't see. "Contact!" I yelled, flailing, trying to wipe the visor with my gloved hand. The dust smeared, but I cleared a patch of vision. We put 10 feet between us and the flower. "Check your seals. Did you breach?" I inhaled deeply. No. Taste. Seal held." "Good," Frank said. "Keep moving, but faster. That thing just signaled everything in the pipe that dinner is served."
We reached Station 308, 2 markers away from the turn. The water was getting deeper. It was up to my knees now, swirling with a stronger current. The pipe was descending. "Movement!" Sarah yelled.
Rear! I spun around. Frank spun with me, covering the front while Sarah covered the back. "What do you see?" Frank barked. "Ripples," Sarah said, her voice tight. "Something is under the surface, following us." I looked down at the black water around my legs. It was opaque. Anything could be down there. "Eyes front," Frank ordered me. "We don't stop. We fight moving." We pushed forward. Station 309. Then the water in front of me began to boil. It wasn't heat. It was turbulence. Bubbles rose to the surface, popping with the smell of methane. A shape rose out of the water 10 yards ahead. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't a reptile. It was a knot, a siphon. It looked like a massive, writhing ball of eels, but the eels were roots. They were dark, slick, and tipped with hook-like thorns. In the center of the mass was a gaping, toothless maw that sucked in water and air with a wet, vacuum sound. Slurp! It blocked the entire tunnel. "Contact front!" I screamed. The siphon didn't roar. It lashed out. A tentacle, thick as a fire hose, shot out of the mass. It whipped through the air and slammed into my chest. Wham! The impact lifted me off my feet. My vest absorbed the thorns, but the force knocked the wind out of me. I flew backward, splashing into the water. "Man down!" Frank yelled. The roar of his rifle filled the tunnel. Crack! 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 The echo was deafening. It felt like ice picks in my ears. Frank was firing into the mass. Chunks of root flew into the air, splashing down. But the siphon absorbed the bullets. It was too dense. Another tentacle shot out, grabbing Frank's leg. It yanked him down. He went under, his rifle firing blindly into the ceiling. Ricochets sparked off the concrete. "Frank!" Sarah screamed, opening fire with her carbine. I scrambled to my feet, coughing water. The siphon was advancing. It was dragging Frank toward that maw. "Fire!" Frank gargled over the comms. "Burn it!" I grabbed the Mossberg, the shotgun, dragon's breath. "Cover your eyes!" I yelled. I racked the slide. Chick-chick! I aimed for the center of the maw. I pulled the trigger. Boom! It wasn't a gunshot. It was a flamethrower blast. A streak of magnesium fire roared out of the barrel, lighting up the tunnel with the brightness of the sun. The round hit the siphon's mouth. Whoosh! The creature ignited. The magnesium burned at 3,000 degrees, turning the water inside the creature into instant steam. The roots caught fire, crackling and popping. The siphon shrieked, a sound like grinding metal. It thrashed, releasing Frank. "Again!" Frank yelled, surfacing. I racked it. Chick-chick. Boom! Another blast of fire. The creature was a torch now, illuminating the tunnel in terrifying detail. It writhed, retreating, trying to dive underwater to extinguish the flames. But magnesium burns underwater. The water around it began to hiss and boil. "Move past it," Frank ordered, scrambling up. "While it's burning, move!" We ran. We splashed past the thrashing, burning monstrosity, hugging the wall. The heat was intense. I could feel it through my gear. The smell of burning plant matter was overwhelming. We scrambled past it, lungs burning, legs churning through the water. We made it around the curve. Station 310. "Clear!" I yelled. "We're clear!" We kept running for another 50 yards before Frank called a halt. "Stop!" he wheezed. "Stop!" We leaned against the wall, gasping. The tunnel behind us flickered with the orange glow of the dying fire. "Are you okay?" Frank asked. He checked his leg. The shin guard was cracked, deep scratches in the plastic, but the leg was intact. "Armor held," he said. He looked at me. "Nice shooting, Tex." I looked at the shotgun. The barrel was smoking. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. "We made a lot of noise,"
Sarah said, reloading her magazine. Every predator in the system heard that. Then we'd better be fast, Frank said. Where's the gate?
We pushed on. The water level was dropping now, but the sludge on the bottom was thicker. Silt, mud. We reached Junction 4 Alpha. It was a massive subterranean chamber. The ceiling vaulted up 20 feet. 4 different tunnels fed into this room, merging their flow into a single larger channel leading down. And blocking that channel was the flow regulator, the gate. It was a massive steel sluice gate, rusted orange and draped in algae. It was down, closed. The water was pooling against it, backing up into the chamber. "It's closed," I said, shining my light on it. "We have to open it to get to the reservoir line." "Where's the mechanism?" Frank asked. I pointed to a catwalk above the waterline, accessible by a rusted ladder. "Up there, manual wheel." "Go," Frank said. "Sarah and I'll hold the perimeter." I climbed a ladder. The rungs groaned under my weight. I reached the catwalk, a metal grate suspended over the swirling water. I ran to the wheel. It was a large iron valve, huge, maybe 3 feet across. I grabbed the rim with both hands and pulled. Nothing. It was seized. "It's stuck!" I yelled down. "Unstick it!" Frank shouted back. He was looking down the tunnel we had just come from. "We have company!" I looked back. In the flickering red light of their flashlights, I saw ripples, lots of them, coming from all 3 feeder tunnels. The siphon hadn't been alone. I gritted my teeth. Come on. I braced my boots against the railing and pulled with everything I had. My muscles screamed. The veins in my neck bulged against the collar of my vest. Creak! The metal groaned. Rust flaked off. It moved an inch. "It's moving! Keep going!" Sarah yelled. She fired a burst into the water. Pop, pop, pop. "Contact! Small ones! Ankle biters!" Below me, the water was churning with small piranha-like root creatures. They were swarming Frank and Sarah, biting at their shin guards. I heaved on the wheel, quarter turn, half turn. Below the gate, the water roared as a gap opened. The level in the chamber started to drop, sucking toward the opening. "More!" Frank yelled, kicking a creature away. "Open it wide enough to fit through!" I spun the wheel. It was loosening now. Turn, turn, turn. The gate rose. 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet. "Go!" I yelled. "Go under!" Frank grabbed Sarah by the vest and shoved her toward the gap. She ducked under the steel gate, disappearing into the dark water on the other side. Frank followed, diving under. I let go of the wheel. I scrambled down the ladder. The creatures in the water surged toward me. I didn't have time to shoot. I jumped. I splashed into the water right in front of the gate. The current grabbed me instantly. It was powerful, a suction force dragging me under the steel wall. I felt something grab my boot, a root, a claw. I kicked violently, connecting with something solid. The suction took hold. I was pulled down, under the cold, rusted metal of the gate, and flushed out the other side, like a rag doll. I tumbled through the water, hitting the concrete floor, rolling, gasping for air in the pocket of space between the water and the ceiling of the new pipe. I came up sputtering. "Elias!" Sarah's voice. A hand grabbed my vest and hauled me up onto a narrow maintenance ledge. I lay there, coughing up sewer water. "We're through," Frank said. He was standing guard, aiming back at the gate. On the other side, the creatures were slamming against the steel, but they were too big to fit through the gap I'd left, or fighting against the pressure. We were in the main trunk line. The pipe here was massive, 15 feet tall, and it was drier. "Check the map," Frank said, breathing hard. "How far to the surface?" I tapped my wrist GPS.
wiping the slime off the screen. 2 miles, I said. Straight shot, then we climb. 2 miles, Frank repeated. Let's hope the fire doesn't get there before we do.
The climb to the surface was the longest mile of my life. The maintenance ladder inside the vertical shaft was rusted, vibrating with the flow of water below us. Step by step, we ascended from the gut of the city toward the throat. Frank went first, pushing open the manhole cover at the top. It took him 3 tries. The vines had grown over it, sealing it with a wax-like resin. He had to use the bottle jack from his pack to crack the seal. Light poured down. Not green light, red light. Frank climbed out, then Sarah, then me. I pulled myself up onto the asphalt of the industrial park. I gasped. The world was on fire. The industrial park sat on a ridge overlooking the valley where our neighborhood, where my house used to be. To the south, the horizon was a wall of black smoke towering into the stratosphere. At the base of that smoke, a line of angry, roiling orange fire was eating the world. They moved the timeline up, Frank said, his voice flat. He was staring at the fire. That's not a containment burn. That's a carpet bombing. The wind shifted, Sarah noted, checking the flag on a nearby warehouse. It's blowing north. The fire is moving faster than they calculated. It's chasing us. We were in a maze of warehouses and factories. The vegetation here was different, the kudzu variety. It draped over the square buildings, turning them into green mounds. The metal siding groaned as the vines crushed the structures. The reservoir, I said, pointing north. It's past the rail yard, maybe a mile. A mile in this terrain is an hour, Frank said. We don't have an hour. Boom! A sound like thunder rolled over us. I looked up. 2 fighter jets screamed overhead, low deck, afterburners glowing against the smoky sky. They dropped canisters into the valley behind us. Thump, thump, thump. Seconds later, the ground shook. A wall of napalm erupted, turning the green jungle into a hellscape. Run, Frank said. Run now. We sprinted. We ran through the overgrown parking lots, dodging between crushed semi-trucks. The vines here were panicked. That sounds crazy, I know, but plants react to heat. The vines were thrashing, recoiling from the south, trying to slither north. We were running with the stampede. We reached the rail yard. Trains were derailed, cars tossed around like toys by the massive roots that had burst through the ballast. Through the gap, Sarah yelled, pointing to a space between 2 boxcars. We scrambled through, and then we saw it, the Titan. Standing between us and the reservoir was a grain silo, but it wasn't just a silo anymore. A massive mutant oak had grown inside it, bursting the metal bands. The tree was 200 feet tall, its bark armored with the silo's steel plating. And hanging from its branches were the siphons, dozens of them. They weren't in the water. They were aerial, swinging like pendulums. "They're blocking the path," I shouted over the roar of the fire. "Not for long," Frank yelled. He racked his shotgun. "Elias, do you have any dragon's breath?" 3 rounds. "Sarah, incendiary grenades?" 2. "Make a hole," Frank ordered. "On my mark." We charged the Titan. It was suicide, but behind us was a wall of napalm moving at 40 miles an hour. Ahead of us were monsters. The siphons sensed us. They dropped from the branches, landing with heavy, wet thuds on the gravel. They blocked the path, their maws opening, tentacles lashing. "Now!" Frank screamed. I raised the Mossberg. I didn't aim, I just pointed at the wall of green and pulled the trigger. Boom! The magnesium fire streaked out, hitting the nearest siphon. It shrieked and ignited. Sarah pulled the pins on her grenades and hurled them over the burning creature. Crump! Crump! White phosphorus exploded, blindingly bright. The Titan tree caught fire. The dry, dead vines hanging from it went up like gasoline-soaked rags. "Through the fire!" Frank yelled. He led the way, firing his rifle, cutting a path through the burning tentacles. We ran into the smoke. The heat was unbearable. My vest felt like it was melting. My respirator filters were clogging with soot. Something grabbed my ankle. I fell hard, hitting the gravel. I looked back. A burning root, thrashing in its death throes, had wrapped around my boot. It was dragging me toward the burning silo. "Help!" I screamed. Sarah spun around. She didn't hesitate. She drew her combat knife and dived at me. She slashed at the root. Chop! Chop! It snapped. She grabbed my harness and hauled me up. "Move, Elias! Move!" We scrambled out of the smoke, coughing, blackened with soot. We broke through the tree line. There it was, the reservoir. A vast, flat expanse of water reflecting the red sky. It looked like a lake of blood. And at the dock, a boat. A Ranger patrol boat, aluminum hull, outboard motor. But the dock was on fire. The embers from the airstrike were raining down. "The gas tank!" Frank yelled. "If the dock goes, the boat goes!" We sprinted the last 100 yards. My lungs were screaming. My legs were numb. We hit the wooden planks of the dock. They were smoking. Frank jumped into the boat. He jammed the key into the ignition. Thank God for government vehicles. The keys are always left in them. Chug, chug, chug. Nothing. "Flood it!" I yelled, jumping in. Sarah jumped in behind me. "Come on, you piece of junk!" Frank roared. He turned the key again. Vroom! The motor caught. Frank slammed the throttle forward. The boat lurched away from the dock just as the pier collapsed into the water, consumed by flames. We sped out into the open water. I looked back. The tree line we had just burst through exploded. The firewall had caught up. The Titan tree was consumed in seconds. The industrial park vanished behind a curtain of orange and black. We were barely ahead of the heat wave. The water around the boat rippled from the shock wave. But we were moving. We were fast, and the roots couldn't swim this fast. We drove north for 20 minutes. The roar of the fire faded to a dull rumble behind us. The smoke plumes stretched out like a blanket, blocking the sun. But ahead there was blue sky. We saw the line. The Ashburn line wasn't a wall. It was a scorched earth zone, a strip of land 3 miles wide where the military had bulldozed and burned everything down to the bedrock to stop the spread. Beyond that strip, civilization. We saw convoys of trucks. We saw tents. We saw the stars and stripes flying from a command post. Frank cut the engine as we drifted toward the shore. We sat there in the silence, the boat bobbing gently. I looked at Frank. He was covered in soot, his tactical vest shredded. I looked at Sarah. She was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but she was smiling. I looked at my hands. I peeled off the ruined welding gloves. My hands were stained black with soot and green with sap, but the glow, the bioluminescence was fading. In the direct sunlight of the safe zone, the fungus was dying.
It was flaking off like dead skin. "We made it," I whispered. I couldn't believe the words. A patrol boat approached us, soldiers with megaphones. "Cut your engine. Hands in the air. Prepare for decontamination." I raised my hands. I looked back one last time at the south, at the pillar of smoke that marked the grave of my city, my house, my life. It was all gone. The attic where I hid, the roof where I fought, the sewers where I crawled. It was just a story now. That was 6 months ago. I live in a settlement now, just outside of Denver. The mountains are safe. The cold keeps the growth in check. Frank is the head of security here. Sarah runs the clinic. We eat dinner together every Sunday. We don't talk about the tunnel. We don't talk about the pods in the living room. But sometimes when the wind blows from the east, I can smell it. That sweet, sickly smell of blooming jasmine and ozone. They say the military has it contained. They say the firebombing worked. They say the verdant purge is over. But I'm an architect. I know about structures. I know about foundations. You can burn the branches. You can chop down the trunk. But you can never, ever kill all the roots. I still check the floorboards in my new apartment. I still tape the vents. And I always, always keep a hatchet by the bed. Because the world didn't end with a bang. It ended with a bloom. And flowers always grow back in the spring.